Now focus on the global situation again and the many crises that characterize our everyday life, the multiple crises and how to navigate through them. And we invited an economist who has lots of experience with crises and is an experienced navigator in times of crisis. She originally comes from Turkey, studied in Istanbul, then she got her PhD at Georgetown University in Washington. In 1992, she started working for the IMF, and she had a remarkable career there. The IMF, a special organization of the United Nations, is advocating sustainable development and growth and wealth for all. She worked there for 23 years as with an interruption when she was chief economist of the Amro Bank. Now she works in the strategy, policy and review department, and Kristalina Georgieva said when she was nominated that her diplomatic instinct, her leadership qualities, and her international engagement would help the IMF help member states in a difficult environment. What this environment looks like, how you help them properly, and how you navigate through these times will be presented by Ceyla Pazarbaşıoğlu.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. My German is ein bisschen, so I think that was great, and it's very good to be here. It's a very timely conference on a topic which is in the minds of everyone, so I really look forward to our discussion today on the forces that are shaping the global economy. What are the trends? What are the recent trends? What are the transmission channels? And what can we do about it, both at the country level, at the regional level, and of course at the global level. So that's what I hope to cover today. So I have a few slides, basically some figures that I'd like to show, so I will go through those as well. I just want to tell you the main message I would like to give today is that there is no silver bullet. We are going through a geoeconomic fragmentation. This has been happening already pre-COVID, and there is no silver bullet. And I think it's very important that we take the measures to be able to find common issues that we need to solve globally and really work on them to find consensus. And that way build trust to be able to resolve these issues in a much deeper way. So I think we need to be pragmatic, what we call pragmatic multilateralism, and try to then build up the momentum and the trust to resolve the issues in a much more sustainable way. So today, as I said, I'm going to first start with talking about where we are now. We have come up with our economic outlook in April, and we have been updating it. And the global growth is slowing down to 2.8% this year and remained around 3% for the next 5 years. And to put this in context, this is the lowest it has ever been since 1990. So we are in a difficult condition in terms of weak global growth, and at the same time we have geoeconomic fragmentation and structural challenges that are taking place. How did we get here? We had decades of globalization, which was really incredible in terms of international cooperation, economic and financial integration, technological progress, and this has delivered results for many. And for 3 decades, we had poverty decline, global poverty declined, and extreme poverty has declined. But the benefits were not shared evenly. We have seen this in a good paper by, good research by Lackner and Milanovic in 2016. They looked at real incomes across the world during 1988 and 2008, and they have this famous elephant chart, if some of you know it. It's basically showing the relative failure to provide gains to the lower part of the income distribution in advanced economies at the expense of lower skilled workers in some key emerging markets and higher skilled workers in advanced economies. So I think this leaving some behind, if you like, has led to weaker and uneven recovery, especially after the global financial crisis, where we did see trust in the institution, trust in the financial sector really weaken. Most recently, of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, the US-China trade tensions, the Russia's war in Ukraine, and the intensification of geoeconomic and geopolitical rivalries. All of these are, of course, adding to national security and economic concerns and leading to policies which then come at the expense of efficiency and global growth. So we already see, as I mentioned, the early signs of geoeconomic fragmentation. If you look at the right-hand slide, you will see that the trade restrictions have been increasing very sharply since 2018. They have increased threefold since then. FDI flows are also changing. They are being increasingly channeled toward politically aligned countries. We have done a chapter in our April World Economic Outlook on this, and companies' reports also mention plans for supply chain reconfigurations towards nearshoring or onshoring. Financial fragmentation is, of course, also seen in the collapse of a significant slowdown in cross-border financial flows, debt portfolio flows, and this is particularly the case in the context of countries that have not condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we do see flows to those countries declining. Energy fragmentation has become a reality following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. European energy prices are expected to be persistently higher, reducing output and living standards. And we have industrial policy fully back in swing. In some cases, countries are turning to discriminatory provisions, more stringent rules of origin, local content rules, and so on. And this, of course, means that there will be much more screening of inbound and outbound investments. So what are the channels in terms of geoeconomic fragmentation? These are the same ones that has helped us in the globalization, trade, technology diffusion, labor, capital flows, as well as provision of global public goods. So we see the pendulum swift from more open policies to much more protectionist policies. And you can see this in also in terms of the uncertainty that is linked to fragmentation. This takes a toll on investment and productivity. So the key concern, of course, is there are certain public goods which can only be addressed if there is global cooperation. And I think that's including, of course, climate action, pandemic preparedness, AI, cybersecurity. These issues are critical in terms of having international collaboration. And if we don't have that, this becomes this ends up with very large costs, especially for the most vulnerable economies. And I think that's a key point that, over the last 3 decades, the globalization has helped many of the more vulnerable economies in terms of capital, goods, services, and people movement. And if we see restrictions in these, most likely we will see some of the low-income countries and emerging markets that will really lose in terms of productivity and living standards. We had seen 1.3 billion people lifted out of poverty in the last decades, tripling of the size of the global economy. But of course, what we see now is basically decoupling, and there are different estimates. You can see them on the screen. The global output loss from trade fragmentation could be as high as 7% of GDP. If we add technological decoupling, this could reach 8 to 12% of GDP. That's the last column in this chart. So this is very much a concern in terms of what countries may need to adjust to. So what needs to be done? What What can we do? And this is what I'd like to spend some time on in terms of a much more pragmatic approach. And we need to acknowledge that there are legitimate concerns in terms of supply chain resilience. We saw this very clearly in the context of the pandemic. There are also legitimate concerns in terms of national and economic security. So I do think we need to acknowledge these concerns and be able to work around them, but not shift to extreme protectionism. So need to find a sustainable balance and a way to cooperate to address common challenges. What are these urgent issues where we think multilateral cooperation is critical and will benefit everyone, so it's in the interest of everyone? These include where benefits align, right? These are the issues in terms of climate, debt is another one, and basically what we need is small-scale agreements, consensus, and then plurilateral agreements that countries, smaller set of countries can agree on, and some sort of guardrails to basically make sure that we can manage the spillovers. When we have the international trade system with, in the context of low growth and high inflation as we see it now, we need trade more than ever. And this is really critical. Strong trade engine by promoting trade, openness, and predictability. That's why WTO and related reforms are very critical. It also includes addressing issues like subsidies and tariffs through strengthened trade rules and securing open markets in modern areas of the global economy, like services and e-commerce. The rules are not yet clear, but we clearly need the rules because this is where trade is going to increase the highest. We also need to be pragmatic, as I mentioned, about strengthening supply chains. Most supply chains have been resilient in the past, but we have seen disruptions to food and energy supplies. And this is, of course, leading to legitimate concerns, but and we have done some research that diversification of supply sources can cut economic losses from supply disruptions by half. But this needs to be done in a smart manner. And countries need to weigh the costs, both at home and abroad, of national security measures on trade and investment. This means that we need to strengthen our analysis collectively in terms of the impact of unilateral actions and design mechanisms to mitigate the spillovers from these actions. So for an example is the exemption of World Food Programme purchases from export restrictions. This has been critical, especially in the aftermath of COVID and the war. But these are not enough. We also need better policies at home, from improving social safety nets to investing in job training, increasing worker mobility across regions, industries, and occupations. And this is really critical to make sure that trade works for all rather than only a few. One of the issues that needs to be addressed in a more collaborative fashion is debt, sovereign debt issues. We have official creditors, which are very different than 20 years ago when we were working mainly with Paris Club, G7 plus countries. Now we have non-Paris Club creditors, about 20% of the sovereign debt of low-income countries. These include China, India, Saudi Arabia, and several others. And this is really critical because about 15% of low-income countries are already in debt distress, and 40% are at high risk of debt distress. And we have 33% of emerging market countries that are facing heightened risk of distress. So it is very difficult for many countries. It's not as bad as HIPC area in terms of pre-HIPC, in terms of arrears and the levels of debt to GDP ratio, But if we don't take action now, we will get there, and that's very costly. So that's why it's important that we take pragmatic actions. What we have done, and it's an example of what I was mentioning, bringing consensus to key issues. We have formed the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. This is co-chaired by our Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, the World Bank President, now Ajay Banga, and the G20 presidency, the Indian Minister of Finance. And it's basically to bring public, private, official creditors, as well as the borrower countries and international institutions to talk about, to try to reach consensus on key issues: information sharing, debt sustainability analysis, contribution of multilateral development banks in terms of grants to countries, and comparability of treatment. Because right now, there's no consensus on these issues. There are lots of questions being raised. So I think it's very important that we take pragmatic action to agree and make progress. And we've already been seeing much more consensus since we have formed the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. Climate. This is really critical, and where Germany has been very active in terms of proposals. We have put in a proposal as the fund. It would be a game changer if we could put an international carbon price floor, and this could be agreed by the EU, US, India, and China. These are the major emitters, and it would focus on carbon pricing or equivalent measures to make sure that there's an equitable process that would complement and reinforce the Paris Agreement. So advanced economies would lead the way, supporting some of these emerging market countries so that there would be spread of low carbon technologies adapted by emerging and developing economies, and that we could have sizable progress in terms of dealing with climate finance. From our part at the fund, we have been looking at of course, doing analysis, coming up with policy initiatives, but also we have reformed our instruments, our toolkit, lending toolkit. We have the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which provides longer-term financing to countries to deal with the structural transformation of climate finance. Better data, and really focusing on how to mitigate some of the industrial policies are also issues that we have been working very hard on. So I would like to basically end my talk by mentioning 3 issues. As I mentioned, we really need to form consensus on what are damaging actions and how can we form some guardrails around them. So that's one. Second, we need to support the most vulnerable members, because otherwise we will have much more social tension, and that's countries, but also within countries, certain populations. And in the context of the fund, we have the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. We have been providing concessional financing to the low-income countries, and we have the annual meetings in Marrakesh in October, first time that the annual meetings, World Bank IMF annual meetings, will be held in the African continent, and we really look forward to making sure that the gap we have in our PRGT trust is filled so that we can continue providing concessional finance to countries. So I will end by saying there is no silver bullet, unfortunately, but we really need to work together to identify urgent common problems, find a way of forming consensus around them, small steps, but then build trust toward a much more coherent and stronger action, because otherwise we're not going to leave a sustainable planet, livable planet to those that come after us. Thank you.
Ceyla Pazarbaşıoğlu, kommen Sie bitte einen Tisch weiter und bleiben Sie hier vorne.
Evet,
Madam Pazarbaşıoğlu, thank you very much indeed. Please come over here to this table. We will have two more panelists joining you here. We've got someone as a guest who is an economist who used to be a politician.
This is your headset, so you can follow the translation. Welcome. Und wir haben einen Politiker
And we invited a politician and economist who is from the Hungarian Socialist Party, having studied in Budapest. He also went to Georgetown University. Between 2005 and 2010, he was a member of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Before then, in 2010, he became the EU Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs and in Brussels. He was pretty much present in the German media, especially when, for example, in 2014, he asked for increased wages in Germany because the wage increases were lagging behind productivity development here in this country. Very interesting. Now he's the General Secretary of the Foundation for European and Progressive Studies, which is a think tank that is doing progressive studies, as the word says, but also wants to support discussions and does studies. And he's also professor at the Corvinus University. Lasse Andor, we're very glad to have him here. And we also have a third panelist here. A man who is very close to the difficult political decisions of these days and who the magazine The Spiegel called the second brain of our Chancellor, because he is one of the most important advisors of Olaf Scholz. He's a state secretary in the Federal Chancellery since 2021. Before that, he was a civil servant and state secretary in the financial ministry since many years. He's been a member of the Social Democratic Party. For a while, he was also the head of the youth organization of the Social Democrats in Rhineland-Palatinate. Before then, he started working for Goldman Sachs, where he had quite the career, getting up to the deputy boss level there, and then he changed back into the ministry. Now in the Chancellery, he is responsible for financial, climate and European policies, but also for G7 and G20 summits. He is a so-called Sherpa, one of the main negotiators, and he's always traveling to where the crises of this world are currently happening. Now he's here, Jörg Kukies. Glad to have you here.
Ja, wir sind komplett auf dem Panel.
Now that completes the panel, and now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to ask you, if you have any questions, please use the chat function, both in the live stream as well as here. Maldis, who can, from time to time, present the most pressing questions. But let's get started here. We have heard so much about the current current challenges and the possible solutions as well in this world. But let me start with a very concrete case. Mr. Kukies, you in the past days thought about how we could convince Intel to set up a chip factory in Germany. And yesterday we got to hear that the federal level, that's the federal government, is going to support it, the settling it with the 10 billions. And I heard that then the Intel boss, slapped me on the back and said, "Thank you guys, thanks for allowing us to do this here." Now, of course, if he's so euphoric, we ask ourselves, did you really negotiate all that well? And then the second question is also, is that one of the answers to one of the many crises that we're currently experiencing? Well, of course, you have to think about whether in a strategic industry like the chip industry, whether you want to be a player or not. And we are talking about an industry where every and any setting up of a plant is being supported financially. This goes back to the fact that a majority of the chip production for a time was to be found in Asia, comparable to the solar industry and other industries. And the main reason, of course, for supporting this decision, or rather for these companies, opening plants in Asia, were cost advantages. But then the United States said, okay, if we want to actually get this strategic industry back, the companies will only do that if we set off the cost difference, which is why the United States then adopted the so-called U.S. CHIPS Act and said that they were ready and willing to even offer a higher percentage of the investment sum as subsidies in order to give them an incentive so that a bigger share of the chip production can happen in the United States. And the American companies, of course, are only coming to Europe when they encounter comparable conditions. Otherwise, they will stay in Ohio, Arizona, Oregon, wherever, because they're being actually welcomed with open arms. So the decision for the federal government
zahlen wir jetzt eine Subvention?
was not whether we would pay subsidies or not. The question was, do we want to have semiconductor production in Germany or not? That was the only real relevant decision. If we said, no, we're not playing this kind of game, might be a legitimate position, but then you will have to just, accept the fact that semiconductors will be produced somewhere else. And if I think back in 2020 and 2021, we had, a diminished growth by 1%, 1.5%, because automotive manufacturers, and you need chips wherever, in cars, in fridges, in toasters, you hardly have any electronic device without chips. So we had a massive problem in our economy because of a shortage of chips. 1.5% minus in terms of growth was, 60 billion. And even if you ignore the Kukies effect, then you end up talking about at least 120 billion euros. So I think this really puts things into perspective, at least a little bit. And something else that's quite frequently forgotten in reporting is that it's also a bit of an investment for the state. So this company is going to employ people. These people will be paying taxes. And we've already seen that around the area where Intel is setting up their plant, that they have software designers and other companies, IT companies, and also, advisors and tax offices. There is going to be a real economic boom. If there is a company with a volume of 36 billion in terms of investments, that's going to have an effect. You can compare it to Dresden, there are so many critics that say it's never going to work out. But if you look at the ecosystem of the semiconductor industry in and around Dresden, you can see that around the original investments that were done by Global Foundries, Infineon, and NXP, that a huge ecosystem was set up around it, so that more and more companies, more and more investments, more and more innovations were actually attracted. And that's what we want to see there. So it's the economic strengthening that you want to achieve, but also reducing dependencies. I would like to also get to talk about the European level, because we're not just talking about Germany. There's also the EU Chips Act. László, Andor, from your point of view, and how far is that an example for Europe trying something together in order to change its dependencies?
Yes, it seems that the European Union needs to learn an entirely new game, right? So this is a period when a lot of reflections have to focus on these questions, how the original model of the European Union, which is basically just to develop the framework for a single market and ensure that the freedom of movement is provided and competition can take place between countries, is good for stimulus, but not necessarily good for the sufficient investment and technology policy that would result in a kind of global competitiveness in the 21st century. So it's not about throwing out the previous model, but building on it and trying to ensure that the EU also can develop the tools of investment and technology policy that help reconciling the original principles with the new challenges of competition.
Ceyla, wenn wir das auf globaler Ebene angucken, es gibt die Sorge.
Now, if we look at that at a global level, there is the concern that there may be a subsidies race, so that the companies actually make huge profits because the states compete with each other in order to try and make sure that they go to their individual countries. Is that dangerous for the states, for nations, for the economies, if that happens in a larger style? Or does that lead to more competition and more growth?
I think there's a balance. If we go too much towards protectionism, I do think that's not good globally. But on the other hand, as was discussed, there is a need to develop some of these industries because of competitiveness at the national level, at the regional level. I think it's a very important balance to make sure that the implications and the spillovers are addressed. If that means trade in certain critical goods, free trade in certain critical goods, or technology transfer to some of the countries that are not able to compete regionally or globally. So I think it's a more inclusive approach that will be needed in order to make sure that we don't end up with efficiency losses in the context of national security.
Sie möchten dazu was sagen, Herr Andor?
If I could just jump on this, yes. The inclusive approach inside the European Union has a name, which is cohesion policy. And this is indeed an important point because if we just open up for more state aid by the stronger countries, that actually would represent a threat to the single market in the European Union and at the end of the day to the cohesion of the system. So the next step what we need to do is to investigate how the European cohesion policy would need to develop further in order to ensure that a new approach to boost technology and competitiveness through a new industrial policy would not aggravate the internal imbalances in the European Union, because that can risk a more general disintegration of the system.
Und halten Sie das für wahrscheinlich und möglich, dass das in Europa...
And why do you think that is even possible in Europe, or is it impossible?
No, it will be possible, but we are not yet there, right? Mm-hmm. So this thinking is just beginning now. How a future cohesion policy can reflect this new reality, because the hitherto model of cohesion was built in the 1990s, mm-hmm. and connects with the stage of the development of the single market in those times. But we are now in a completely different ballgame.
Mm-hmm. Ceyla, wenn wir nochmal auf der globalen Ebene bleiben, Sie haben ja eben sehr schön...
Now, Ceyla, if we stay at the global level, you just very nicely described the challenges. Do you have the feeling that in the states and the nations, or even in politicians, that they really understood what the problems are and what needs to be done? Or do you really still have to convince them a lot?
Well, I mean, it is difficult whenever the national security issue is discussed. Of course, everyone gets very defensive, and a lot of the more global or inclusive debate gets pushed aside. So yes, it is difficult, but I think what we have been asking for is understandable that countries need to strengthen certain supply chains. It's better for them, it's more resilient, and it's more efficiency. But at the same time, there are ways of designing policies which limits the implications on others. And I think that's where the discussion needs to be. What is the best way to design certain policies, understanding the spillovers, and then dealing with them with either complementary policies or different design of policies.
Ich habe es eben gesagt, Herr Kukies, Sie sind Sherpa.
Now, Mr. Kukies, I just said it a moment ago. Mr. Kukies, you're a Sherpa, and perhaps you could give us a glimpse behind the curtain, behind the scenes. What is the international community negotiating right now in order to buffer off these crises, and where do you anticipate the lines of conflict? Well, many of these points were actually a huge topic at the G7 summit in Hiroshima. The question where to strike a balance between a further integration on the one hand and the effort of, or the endeavor of giving enough space to international division of labor. And we have many positive examples in the declaration of the G7. For example, there is an offer to the Global South that we made when it came to the topic of developing critical raw materials, and we extend an offer to cooperate there. What we've seen in the past rather frequently is that in those countries of the Global South, there is relatively little value creation, which means that raw materials were just extracted from the ground and were then exported for further processing at a relatively early stage in the value chain to other countries. So this is not optimal in terms of the environmental impact, but of course also not in terms of the partnership approach, because the countries of the Global South had relatively little from, just selling raw materials. And our objective is now to really think more about, for example, in the case of lithium, which parts of the follow-up production process for batteries could actually remain in the countries of the Global South so that they have incentives for growth. It's not easy to then work out the details, but, it is the general approach and the general direction that we start thinking of. And what we also want to do is to massively expand the funding for climate measures on a global scale. And Thursday and Friday, we will have a major summit in Paris, organized by President Macron, and where we will again look at the question of, the connection between international climate financing and the support of more vulnerable states when it comes to the effects of climate change, but also the question of the reforms of multilateral development banks, for example. We want to discuss these questions and look at how we can make them invest more targeted in the area of climate neutrality, and would that also, create some local growth impulses. You now mentioned the global south, which is very interesting, because China is also, showing a lot of effort when it comes to African countries, investing a lot there as well. And you also pointed out that it was not optimal in the past, the way it, went. But are you not a bit late there? Have you not neglected it for too long in the past? Well, the short answer is yes. And why? Well, the Chinese minister-president was visiting, or has been visiting, Berlin until a few minutes ago, and also highlighted that China still perceives itself as a developing nation. But still, and in spite of all criticism, and even justified criticism, China thought in a much more strategic way about the question of supply chains, critical materials, the kinds of raw materials that they actually need for their economic development and for sustainability in the 21st century. More than us. We relied on the market regulating everything. And, compared it to the situation with the Russian gas, wherever we had the cheapest source, we went there and sourced our material there. Now, in hindsight, it turned out to be a huge mistake that really cost our economies billions and billions of euro. We lost prosperity, and there is also the danger now that industries will move and shift operations to other countries because of the increased energy prices. Those are all the effects of having focused too much on a single region, and they have now massively negative macroeconomic effects. And China, and their need for raw materials, they diversified it rather more strategically than we did. We were just watching, and we said, oh yes, the refineries and the processing industries for raw materials, well, it's a smelly thing, there's a lot of smoke and it's not nice to look at, and then we've got the protests from our citizens, so let's just get everything from China, without even thinking about the fact that we may be creating the same kinds of dependencies. So we really have to be careful, and we have to be more independent. Okay, now if we now look at Europe, Ms. Andor, and ask ourselves whether we can actually, rein in the market a bit by, using more of the state. Can we unify European countries, or will these crises lead to new fractures and divisive lines? What's your take on that as a European politician?
Well, the risk is always there. In the European institutions in the recent years, the big question has been, are we now smarter than in the previous crisis? And it's partly a matter of smartness and being able to learn from the previous mistakes of crisis response. But we also have to recognize somehow that different countries in Europe represent different economic models, different philosophies. Maybe this gap is a little bit more moderate after the Brexit, right? Because the UK used to represent a kind of extreme in the diversity and sometimes competition of different economic models. But still there is a diversity. And there is also an East-West divide in terms of some of the Western countries, Germany remaining on the cutting-edge technologies, quite focused and successfully stepping up to a higher level of competitiveness. Some Eastern countries remaining in what we call the middle-income trap. And this is, if we don't pay attention, becoming a factor that can reproduce an East-West divide. And we really need to think hard how to ensure that the Eastern countries also give up this obsession with low tax, low wage strategy, again aggravating the East-West imbalances in the European Union, sometimes leading to political polarization as well.
Okay, what would you suggest?
Well, I think most of these issues have to be put on the table very openly. For example, the tax question only arrived to the European table recently because the United States took the initiative about the global minimum taxation of corporations and not as an intra-European one, right? So if the European Union itself could bring it forward to say that, okay, for specific purposes, we need a deeper European engagement in this. Partly it's there because of Next Generation EU, because what was borrowed for Next Gen EU has to be repaid somehow. So now the European taxation is a real question. And then to engage countries which have been skeptical in this field, and they are partly islands or landlocked countries. So there are two specific groups of countries which are skeptical about EU tax coordination. They can be brought to the table, I think, if we also connect it to some kind of collective opportunities of industrial policy and a new attitude to cohesion.
Oh ja, bitte, Ceyla.
There's also, of course, the business of finishing the banking union and the common capital market union. I think that's going to be also very critical to make sure that the benefits are shared.
Okay, also wir haben 2 Punkte, Bankenunion.
Okay, there are 2 topics we talk about, the taxation system, the banking union. Let's take a look at Germany. László, Andor, what do you expect from Germany? You can talk to Mr. Kukies directly if you wish.
Sorry, in what regard, what do I...
Okay, also wir haben jetzt über die Banken...
Now, we spoke about the banking union, and we spoke about the question of the tax system in Europe. And you made mention of the fact before that there are countries moving into different directions. What role should Germany play?
Maybe just to highlight something. A couple of years ago, the Hans-Böckler Stiftung, the IMK, produced a very interesting paper about 4 or 5 years ago, how to repair the roof when the sun is shining. Because 4 or 5 years ago, before the pandemic, we had a period of growth, unemployment was going downwards, and there were a lot of papers on the table left behind from 2012, 2015 about how to strengthen the European economic architecture in order to ensure that in the next recession, in the next crisis, we perform better than in 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13. And this was definitely not done. Nevertheless, when the European Union had to improvise in 2020, the EU improvised quite well. And I think the German Social Democrats were playing a very important role in this. But it has not yet become structural. And now we are facing a very great risk that when the EU wants to go back to fiscal rules and end the suspension of the fiscal rules, and if we behave like the Bourbons, who learned nothing and forgot nothing, then obviously we can bring back the old risks of financial failure, which brought us into the deep trouble more than 10 years ago. So I think now there is a need for, on the one hand, imagination, on the other hand, strong commitment to make progress in the spirit of EU solidarity if we want to resolve this debate about the fiscal rules.
Okay, Sie haben dieses schöne Bild benutzt.
Well, you used this wonderful imagery.
Genau, und stellen Sie auch Fragen. Ne?
And please ask questions in the audience.
Publikum, jetzt ist die Gelegenheit.
We are looking forward to your questions. You used the beautiful imagery of the roof that needs to be fixed when the sun is out. Now it seems to be raining, dripping a little bit through the roof. Mr. Kukies, what's the government going to do? How is the roof going to be fixed now it's raining a little bit?
Dieses Bild auf ganz viele Aspekte.
Well, you can translate this imagery to various different sectors, energy policies, for example. Now, in the fortunate situation that due to different factors, the energy prices have gone down from peak values in the course of last year.
Das darf uns aber nicht dazu führen.
But this must not lead to the fact that we rest on our laurels. Especially last week, we've had the first big auction of offshore wind in the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. And this led to a very interesting result. You know, by way of conclusion, in the last 20 years, the national government
offshore wind gebaut.
Built 7.8 gigawatts in offshore wind.
In einer Auktion
2 Wednesdays ago, we auctioned 7 gigawatts in one day only, so we nearly doubled the figures in just one go. The second interesting result is that 4 companies in the bidding procedure on the lowest subsidies that they applied for in order to produce offshore wind asked for 0 subsidies. So we don't have to really spend anything in our climate and transition fund. And now we have a second round where the bidders tell us what they are going to pay to us if we give them plots of land in the North Sea in order to produce offshore wind for very little money, cheaper than coal, cheaper than gas. And to me, it's the main motivation to accelerate the process. We do not only want to double or triple or quadruple or increase wind and solar energy by a factor of 5. We need to tap this potential now because the energy prices are not that low that we prevent the absolute crisis from emerging. In the transitional period, of course, the infrastructure measures that were made have to be used for us to be able to ensure our supply sources in the transitional period that we meet gas. And we need to try to move out of coal and gas and nuclear. And we want to bring about a transition towards hydrogen. That is basically our strategy. That's what it's all about in a nutshell, in order to fix the energy policy roof, which really collapsed in Germany, in order to use the same image. And it will be much more cost efficient with regards to the energy that we receive, because renewables are not only positive because they are green, but also positive because they're very cost efficient, they're cheap. Marlies, questions from the audience, over to you. Yes, there is a question for Mrs. Pazarbaşoğlu. This refers to your expertise concerning the Turkish financial markets. The question is, especially Spanish banks are very much involved in Turkish activities. 80 billion of Turkish loans were taken on in their books. Same holds true for French books. Banks. Well, if Turkey collapses, will there be a new banking crisis in Europe? I don't know whether the facts and figures are correct, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more about this.
So I will not make comments about Turkey because I am from Turkey and I work at the fund, so I need to have an arm's length view in terms of the developments in Turkey. They have a new finance minister, new central bank governor. We'll have to see what policies will be put in place. They have been saying that they will put in the right policies, so we have to see. In terms of European banks' exposures to Turkey or any other country, that I can talk about because we had the great financial crisis in 2008, and there were regulations that were put in place. I actually worked on many of the countries, including Spain. So there are capital rules, liquidity rules, higher quality of capital, and also putting aside provisions in case loans go non-performing. So I think, of course, these banks know their exposures, they look very carefully at the way things are developing, and they have good risk management systems. Hopefully, they have put in place the contingencies to deal with problems that can happen. The exchange rate has been depreciating. You asked about Turkey. In Turkey, and that hasn't impacted the loan books as much of these banks. But the ECB has been doing stress tests. They have been looking at the bank's strength. So I think it's important to answer this in a more general way, that I do think the banking system is better supervised, better risk managed. But again, one has to be always alert and make sure that measures are taken to avoid excessive exposure to a specific country.
Ich hätte sogar noch eine zweite Frage hier.
Yeah. I do have a question, Stefan. Mr. Kukies, when you hear this about the banking sector, it's a bit difficult to understand, to imagine that 10 or 12 years after the big financial crisis, banks once again go bankrupt, as happened in the US. Do you think that we've learned our lesson, or do you have to be prepared for more? The fact that banks go bankrupt is, per definition, nothing of the extraordinary. In the US, banks go bankrupt time and again. The only question is, have we secured the system so well that we will be able to survive, or will there be spillover effects? I think the cases that occurred in the US and in Europe, in Switzerland to be precise, have shown us very clearly that, first of all, yes, banks can go bankrupt. And secondly, the system has become much more resilient because the banks have much more capital. The rules and regulations that were adopted in order to make interaction more transparent and to reduce interconnections in the interest of central peering mechanisms that provide securities and guarantees for each other goes to show that the basic underlying phenomenon, if the bank takes the wrong business decisions, of course, can go bankrupt. And we all know about the history of the Silicon Valley Bank. This makes it quite easily understandable that mistakes were made, but the decisive point is what's going to happen afterwards. And here, I think the situation does not look as doomy and gloomy as some might think, because despite all the negative news, it seems to be the case that, especially from a macroeconomic perspective for the entire economy, we have not yet had any negative repercussions. And these banks were not all very small. The Silicon Valley Bank was a small regional bank. No, it had a balance sheet total of $200 billion. It's anything but small. It might have been regional, but anything but small. And the fact that banks like these, or the Credit Suisse, which is even bigger, was the first global systemic bank that was not really dissolved, but due to the creditors and shareholders could be solved with a limited state aid. But there was still trouble in the banking sector for a couple of weeks after that, but now the whole thing has calmed down. If you compare this to the Credit Suisse, at that particular moment in time, over that weekend, the Credit Suisse was bigger than Lehman Brothers before. So all the second or third round effects that led to a global crisis after Lehman Brothers did not take place, although the bank that was in trouble was much bigger. So this goes to show that many of the reforms that happened after the financial market crisis have had a positive repercussion. Now over to Marlies.
So the Silicon Valley Bank, it's the 16th largest bank in US, and it was not subject to the same rules as the largest banks. So some of the regulations were actually rolled back after 2008, including taking regional banks out of stress tests, out of capital requirements, and so on. In Europe, all banks are subject to the same rules. So I think it's important. And the other issue that we learned in every crisis, you learn something, is the incredible, I mean, this was a deposit run like no other because of using social media. So there were billions of deposits, dollars of deposits that were taken out of the institution within a day. And therefore, of course, now in everyone's agenda and financial regulators' agenda is how to deal with these type of very strong deposit outflows through using social media and electronic means.
Ja. Okay, ich glaube, wir müssen diesen Bankenteil jetzt einmal kurz abschließen.
I think we should conclude this section about the banks. Marlies, over to you again. Well, I had a question relating to the banks, and I think it's a very exciting one. Till Kupfer asked Mr. Kukies, which role can big investment banks such as the European Investment Bank play? And private investments, how can they be promoted for green projects? And how can investments for fossil fuels be diverted? Excellent one. Let me just give you one example. Scholars always say that in the Sahel zone and in northern Africa, the conditions for the generation of electricity coming from solar are just as favorable as in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and in other countries of the Middle East. Nevertheless, all the big projects on most of the big projects for renewables,
beispielsweise Saudi-Arabien,
for example, are carried out in Saudi Arabia, 4.5 gigawatts solar energy.
also Elektrizitätskosten von ungefähr
Electricity costs amount to 1/3 of what we can generate here in Germany at best.
rein aus den Erträgen.
They use the funds coming from the revenues they generate with oil and gas.
Ölfirma Saudi
They've got a state oil-run company, Saudi Aramco, with 161 billion euros in profit last year, so funding is no problem to them at all. When we talk to the energy ministers, the ministers of finance, and the heads of state and government of the African states, this is always the main problem. How can you
sind da.
guarantee a similarly cost-efficient funding scheme? The conditions are good, even better, concerning sun and wind in the region. But this is where the EIB, the World Bank, and many of the other international global banks and players have ample opportunities. The new boss of the World Bank announced that this was going to be one of his major objectives. How can these investments be made available? By producing cost-efficient and cheap types of electricity in those locations where they couldn't be settled in the free market. The interesting thing is that if the financial resources are available, the markets are ready to go for such projects. These cases have already occurred. In the south of Morocco, wind energy is produced by a German company at very favorable conditions. So these projects exist, but not in the large quantities, not in the volumes as expected, because the financial resources are missing. Okay, Jalad, when we look at the role of the international organizations, they're really going for that. They provide the funds. Do they fill this gap which needs to be filled? And one additional question, shouldn't we have done this more intensively at an earlier stage?
So the multilateral development banks, and of course we have, our mandate is different, but we are also supporting, of course, the climate transition in line with our mandate. But MDBs alone or official bilateral credit alone is not going to be enough. You need the private sector to come in. And for that, you need, like you said, you need the companies to be able to make the returns. And what affects those returns? One is cost of capital, but it's also important that the countries themselves take the reforms that are needed to make sure that the regulatory uncertainty is not there, corruption is, procurement rules and all these other rules are also in place to make sure that the private sector can actually invest and make returns. They are not charities, they want to make returns. And I think the MDBs have a key role to help countries reform and also have hedging strategies and other concessional loans to de-risk or to provide some support to private sector to be able to come in. But I think everyone has a role to play, including the countries themselves, to make sure that the enabling environment is there. The Paris Summit on Thursday is going to discuss this issue. My concern is a lot of advanced economies, including the US, of course here in Germany, are doing these investments, and they have much more certainty and about returns. So you know, many of the emerging markets and developing countries will be next in line. So this has to be factored in terms of decision making to make sure that there's technology transfer and diffusion to those countries as well.
László, Andor.
I would like to highlight something because I think very few people know about this because the question was about the EIB, the European Investment Bank. And I happen to be on the supervisory board of the European Fund for Strategic Investment, which was basically created by the Juncker plan a few years ago. And what was an absolute novelty in the functioning of this FC was a participation of stakeholders, including civil society organizations, in developing and evaluating the business plan of this fund. So many of you probably know about the concept of participatory budgeting, and with this, the EIB actually made a big step toward participatory public banking. And that's a very interesting lesson from the previous crisis. I think this experience of the FC should somehow be developed further. Not least because the fact which Jörg Kukies emphasized, that now the European banking sector is much more stable and it turned out to be more resilient, also has a direct consequence on public banks. That the public banks, which the EU tends to call promotional banks, started to play a greater role in resource allocation. And that's supposed to provide greater stability to the system. So other countries, of course, not in the same scale, but started to imitate the KfW and similar types of banks. And but then, in order to ensure that these banks and this new model and the different balance than the previous one between public and private is working out better, I think this engagement with stakeholders in terms of designing business plans, but also the assessment, is something which we would need to think about and continue.
Okay, ich würde gerne am Schluss nochmal auf ein...
Right, by way of conclusion, I'd like to draw your attention to one more topic which turned out to be very important today and yesterday during the award-winning ceremony. How do we reply in Europe to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US? How do we not only repair the roof, but how do we install solar panels on it? And maybe also the promotion banks or development banks can play a very important role. What do we need in Europe? Higher CO2 taxes? Will that be enough? Or will additional steps have to be taken? Increased subsidies, which is what the US are now showing us. In a nutshell, what's your take on that? First of all, László Andor, please, the European perspective.
Question at the very end. Look, I think Europe has a problem of the scale, right? That because of the lack of central fiscal capacity at the European level, the EU has a much different intervention capacity than either the United States or China or even Japan. So how to kind of square the circle, I don't know. I think Europe, first of all, needs to defend and further develop the instruments which we already have, like the carbon border adjustment mechanism. You have to say it with one breath, it's a long thing. But I think it needs to be protected and maybe further developed because that matches the institutional reality of the European Union and can ensure that what we set out as targets in the European Union can also be applied elsewhere. But this is, I would say, something that requires further dialogue with the global partners. In order to ensure that we do not throw out the baby with the bathwater, but arrive to the pragmatic multilateralism, which was highlighted in the introductory talk. Because I think the risk is that throwing out the neoliberal model leads us into the Hobbesian world economy, and that the fight of everybody against everyone. Instead of that, I think what can be preserved from multilateralism has to be, although recognizing that what failed, of course, would need to be dropped and sidelined.
Jörg Kukies, wie kann dieser Weg aussehen, wenn man sich das Thema...
What can we do if we look at how do we reply to Inflation Reduction Act? What can we copy? What can we mitigate? I think it's quite interesting because the journalist who 1 week ago wrote a long article about the fact that Germany is getting deindustrialized because everything is moving over to Inflation Reduction Act, in brackets because the US Americans pay a lot of significant subsidies, wrote an article yesterday complaining that Intel comes to Germany because Germany pays subsidies, but you can't do both at the same time. You can't praise the US for paying out subsidies and settling down industries and then criticizing Germany for paying out subsidies and trying to settle down industries. I think in Germany we have to take the right decision. the right strategic decisions on doing what is necessary in order to prevent a deindustrialization of Germany from happening. This is one of the core points in our industrial and economic policies. We need to continue to be an appealing partner. This is why we spent weekends with the European Commission to carry out a common project of European interest, which makes it possible for us to use Thyssen, Salzgitter and Saarstahl and decarbonize them and support them in this endeavor. It's a much more expensive source of energy, but it's climate neutral. And we need them in order to switch off the blast furnace and build direct production plants which make direct steel production in Germany possible. 88% of our CO2 emissions. It costs us billions, no doubt about it. But we've got to be courageous enough to embark into this direction. Salzgitter, Thyssen, and Saarstahl show us very clearly that deindustrialization and a loss of companies moving elsewhere can be prevented from happening. Let me give you an example. Wolfspeed producing chips in the former coal region. Infineon, 5 billion with the investment in Dresden. And this is how we go to show that such economic policies, if we pursue them actively in a creative manner, can turn out to be successful. And I can already announce it is not going to be the last case. Back to you, Ceyla. You're looking at things from a global perspective. When you hear about the different ideas which are now being discussed, there is an interesting competition of different concepts going on. What could be copied? CO2 taxation? Does it help us solve the problem, or do we need something like subsidy programs? What would be your recommendation for the SMEs?
So I think from a global perspective, it is a public good, global public good. We need to address climate change and related implications. So that, I think, does give the rise to subsidies. And these subsidies, quote-unquote green subsidies, can be justified. But I think the key here is to make sure, you mentioned SMEs, the key here is that we don't end up with protecting large companies which are making very large profits and not necessarily addressing neither the global nor the national challenges. So I think there's a balance between providing the necessary incentives, be it in the form of subsidies or EIB. I think EIB is doing really great investments in many countries, including some of the sub-Saharan countries, but making sure that we find the right balance in terms of addressing the challenges, but at the same time containing some of the large corporate gains which are actually happening.
Übersetzung läuft noch. Vielen Dank für dieses spannende Panel. Ich glaube, wir haben.
Thank you very much for this exciting panel. We looked at a lot of interesting issues. We looked at the problems of the world. The sun is shining through the roof. It's nice to conclude. Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking the time to participate in this panel.
Thank you very much.